Well, thanks for the introduction, Carol. It's a pleasure to be here. This lecture is being tape recorded for posterity. So since we're in the 21st century, let me remind you to turn off cell phones, please, because otherwise it'll disrupt my immortal words that are being tape recorded here. Even my wife still has her cell phone still on. Okay. Thank you. When I started college many years ago, I was told that if you steal from one person, it's called plagiarism. But if you steal from 10 people, it's research. And if you steal from hundreds, you're a scholar. So, speaking to you as a scholar tonight, I want to talk about the Holland and Lincoln tunnels. These are facilities that are owned and operated by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Now, as New Yorkers, you probably know, editorial writers tend to regard the Port Authority in one of two ways. First, as a whipping boy to blame for all the problems of New York City's infrastructure, or second, as an ATM machine to pay for their favorite projects. So what I'm going to try to do tonight, hopefully, is hi, you're behind the pillar there. I'm going to try to give a little more nuanced view. To be sure, there are problems at the Port Authority, but historically this has been an agency of tremendous integrity and competence. Having said that, let me tell you a little bit about my work. This book we're talking about tonight is called Crossing Under the Hudson. It's the story of the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, published by Rutgers University Press. And in it, I tried to look at the planning and the construction and the engineering and the financing, because, of course, these are key links in the transportation infrastructure of New York and New Jersey. But I also tried to place these things into a meaningful cultural context, which I hope to illuminate as we go along. These two tunnels carry some 76 million vehicles per year. What I've tried to do is talk not just about their practicality, but also about, believe it or not, the music, the art, the literature, the poetry, and the motion pictures that these things have inspired. I'd like to begin with a literary quotation. This is from a novel which was written by Edith Wharton, and it's set in the 1870s. It's talking about the protagonist. As he paced the platform, waiting for the Washington Express, he remembered that there were people who thought that there would one day be a tunnel under the Hudson, through which trains of the Pennsylvania Railway would run straight into New York. They were the brotherhood of visionaries, people who predicted the building of ships that could cross the Atlantic in just 5 days, the invention of a flying machine, lighting by means of electricity, telephonic communication without wires, and other Arabian Night miracles. So you see, like, we take the Holland and Lincoln tunnels so much for granted that we've lost this sense of awe and mystery about the whole thing. But looking at it historically, it took, to make the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, it took generations of politicians, financiers, and engineers, and there were big dreams and many failed schemes. So I guess my point is that what looks like a pipe dream today can become reality tomorrow. So Carol, when we were talking a few minutes ago, asked me, well, how did I get the idea for the book in the first place? When I was writing about the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, I was going through the weekly reports of the executive director, who was Austin Tobin, to the commissioners. And in there, he would week by week detail what he was trying to do. And I was trying to focus on the Twin Towers, but I kept getting diverted with all this interesting stuff about bridges and tunnels and airports and seaports. It was like eating Cracker Jacks, and I really had to discipline myself to focus. But as I was doing this, I kept saying, well, you know, there's other topics to be explored here. So back in 2006, I approached Marley Wasserman, who's the executive director of Rutgers Press, and told her I was interested in working on the tunnels, and she gave me the green light. Now, today, as I indicated a moment ago, they're mostly unseen and unloved, but in the 1920s, people were really enchanted by the idea. So, definitions. A tunnel is an underground passageway completely enclosed, except for openings at the entrance and the exit. One of the foremost tunnel engineers said, a tunnel is a facility that leaks, and I'll get to that later. The Holland Tunnel was completed in 1927, but it wasn't the first tunnel under the Hudson. There were two earlier such tunnels, but they were for railroad trains, not for automobiles. And let me just briefly explain, it's a lot easier to build a railroad tunnel than an automobile tunnel, for all kinds of reasons. I'll mention two. A train is on tracks, so presumably the train doesn't like wander left and right and require wide lanes. The train can go through a very narrow tunnel because presumably it stays on the tracks. The other thing is, if the locomotive is electrified, guess what? No carbon monoxide. So it's a piece of cake to build a railroad tunnel, comparatively speaking. Now, there were two earlier tunnels. The first railroad tunnel was attempted in the 1870s. This was to be used by the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad. But it's very tricky using 19th century technology. I'll briefly explain. It's like you're shoving this tube through the mud, and you use compressed air to hold back the mud in the river. But it's very tricky. If you don't use enough compressed air, the river will come into your tube, and if you use too much, you'll blow the workmen out into the river, which is what they did, alas. They killed 20 workers, and it was such a tragedy that they simply gave up. The idea was abandoned for some 20 years till they could refine the technology. The next attempt for the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad was in 1902, and it was completed in 1907. There was a similar project, as you probably know, for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Construction for the Pennsylvania Railroad tunnel began in 1904 and was completed in 1910. Now, both the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad built these tunnels with terminals for passengers. What never did get built was a freight terminal. Never, and it's so obvious. Why don't you build a freight terminal? I was discussing this with Carol earlier. How do I put this delicately? The longshoremen on the west side didn't think it was a good idea. You can connect the dots. Okay, so we succeed in building these two railroad tunnels, but as I'm sure you know, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there's a lot of automobiles being built. You know, Henry Ford, the Model T. And how do you accommodate all these motor vehicles? Well, they knew they had to do something, but should they build a bridge or should they build a tunnel? And on the face of it, you would think that a bridge would be cheaper than a tunnel. But there's a big catch. What's the catch? If you're building a bridge across the Hudson, it has to be very, very high in order to allow the ships to pass underneath. Now think about it. Very high bridge, what's that mean? It's going to be a long angle of descent. Long angle of descent in Jersey City, long angle of descent into Manhattan. You're going to have to destroy an awful lot of buildings, and it's going to get very expensive. Even if you have the right of eminent domain and you can condemn the buildings, you still have to compensate the owners, and it was just prohibitively expensive. It's very surprising. The projected cost of a tunnel was $11 million. The projected cost of a bridge was $48 million. Most of that to pay for the condemned land to make for these gradual landings. Well, the brilliant thing about the Holland Tunnel is that it was the first subaqueous vehicular tunnel. That's kind of a mouthful. Subaqueous vehicular tunnel. And the breakthrough was the ventilation system, which is something we take for granted today. But this was the real breakthrough of Clifford Holland. And in brief, the way it works is you blow in fresh air at the gutter level, right at street level, and then you exhaust it through the ceiling, and you do this at a tremendous rate, and that's what makes possible the tunnel to be usable. Otherwise, without a good ventilation system, the tunnel becomes a giant gas chamber because of the carbon monoxide. So the Holland Tunnel was built with a height of 12 feet 6 inches. The lanes are 8 feet wide. And today, as you probably know, cars are able to use it, and small trucks, 1, 2, and 3 axle trucks. That's because these lanes are very narrow. Okay. I think one of the reasons, well, how do I explain this? The Holland Tunnel, when they first built it, the authorities were terribly worried that the whole project would be a financial bust, because they spent all this money to build it, and then the question was, would the public accept it? Because it's kind of, if you stop to think about it, it's kind of scary driving underneath a river, you know. What if, is the damn river gonna come in on me? Am I gonna be drowned to death, you know? It's scary. I think most of us, the way we deal with it, we don't think about it. But some people do. And here is a person, I keep forgetting about you. There's a person that I interviewed, and here's what she said about driving through the tunnel. She had an extreme case of tunnel phobia. Here's what she said. Every single time after a ride through the tunnel, I basically calculate whether or not I will make it should an explosion occur. Is this normal? It starts out very calmly. Then I get into a panic because I know I won't make it out if I get stuck in the middle. My eyes start to tear up. I think of all the things I should have told my children before I left home. It gets bad. And finally, I ease up again once I know I'm close to the end. I actually have to count things to make me not focus on my inevitable death. So I count the dividers until I see light coming from the outside. Once I feel that I can survive the crash, I stop counting, look for my easy pass, like nothing ever happened. People around me see me as just another car on the road. They have no idea of what I just went through. Well, think about it. If it's scary to drive through, think about the men who dug the tunnel in the first place. Okay? I met one of them. The guy's name is Tom Kelly. He did me the favor of blurbing my book. He is a lifelong sandhog and author. He wrote a novel called Sandhogs, and he's the son of a sandhog. And he's a relatively young man. He's my contemporary, relatively young. Relatively young. Relatively young. And so, of course, he did not dig the Holland Tunnel. He did not dig the Lincoln Tunnel. What he was actually dealing with, and probably you know about this, the New York City Water Tunnel number 3, which goes from upstate New York to Manhattan, 60 miles long, $6 billion project, begun in 1970, and will be completed in 2020. So anyway, here's his description. he worked his way through Fordham and Harvard by being a sandhog in the summers. And he got the job, of course, because his father got him into the Union. But it's the most amazing thing. Here's his description of going to work. Again, it's not the Holland and Lincoln, but a similar experience. Okay, he says, and he takes on the pen name of Billy. Billy's heart gained a few beats as they plunged away from the night. It was something he often felt dropping into the earth, knowing that his father had once made the same trip and never seen the sky again. He went to work one night and was buried beneath tons of bedrock, his body crushed beyond recognition. Billy always thought of that little slap of fear. That was his father's way of urging him to get out of this business and to get an education. He knew the feeling would pass when he reached the bottom and started work. Well, here's the thing. Billy had an uncanny physical resemblance to his father. So when he went to work, his fellow workers always were a little aghast because they thought they were seeing a ghost. So he's 800 feet beneath the surface, and here's what he sees and hears. Arc lamps near the shaft cast dead white light. Strings of incandescent bulbs lined both sides of the tunnel, fading into the mist. The wet air was a mixture of diesel fumes and rock dust. The tunnel bellowed with sound. Water pumps sucked and spat. Diesel motors, some new and finely tuned, others old and struggling, rumbled and coughed. High voltage lines buzzed, air compressors hissed. Hoses and wires ran through the tunnel, a tangle of conveyances. Chaos, noise like the scream of a construction site jammed into a subway station. Billy winced and paused, put his earplugs in. These sandhogs are remarkable people. It's a very strange trade. It's a little of this and a little of that. You have to know about steel fabrication. You have to know about plumbing, electricity, ventilation, even railroads. There's a little railroad to get rid of the muck. Cranes, elevators, heavy machinery. It's just no one thing. It's a whole process. Anyway, I told you about the railroad tunnels. So what finally motivated the powers that be to go ahead with the vehicular tunnel? Well, they'd long felt that there ought to be a connection by motor vehicle between New York and New Jersey. But what really clinched it was the winter of 1917-1918. It was an unusual 100-year winter. The Hudson River was frozen solid. I mean solid. And traditionally, the way you got goods from New Jersey to New York was by way of barges across the Hudson River. Well, the barges couldn't move. Think about it. No coal was getting into Manhattan. No food was getting into Manhattan. People were cold and hungry. This finally motivated the powers that be to get moving. The ice melted, and so did the opposition to a tunnel. So, as I said, there was that whole thing, should we build a bridge, should we build a tunnel, and as you know, they decided on the tunnel. But New York and New Jersey finally inked an agreement in 1919, almost immediately after this severe winter. And which is kind of amazing because normally New York and New Jersey can't agree on the time of day. So they hired Clifford Holland, who was a remarkably young man. He was only 36 years old. And immediately Clifford Holland had three big problems, which I'll briefly explain. Problem number one was that there were two competing plans. Clifford Holland's plan was to build two cast iron tubes side by side, one inbound and one outbound. But there was competition. General George Goethals, remember him, the hero of the Panama Canal? He had an alternate scheme. His scheme was to build a concrete tube, very large, with an upper deck and a lower deck. Well, most engineers that I've talked to say cast iron is a much better bet than concrete. But at the time, Goethals was very senior and very prestigious, and so Holland had a hell of a struggle to persuade people to go with his plan, which he finally did. Problem number 2. The mayor of Jersey City was a man named Frank Hague. Need I say any more? Frank Hague, his basic strategy towards any civic improvement was, what's in it for me? And problem number 3 was the threat of caisson disease, because when you're digging these tunnels, the sandhogs have to work under compressed air. Fortunately, a great deal was learned about caisson disease from the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. The whole idea is that, as you probably already know, if you compress the air, ambient air is made up of about 20% oxygen, about 80% nitrogen. If the air is compressed, the nitrogen enters the bloodstream. If you come up too quickly, your blood will be like a Coke bottle that's shaken, and you get the bends, which can cause paralysis. It's bad stuff. But what they learned, fortunately, was using compressed air at 37 pounds per square inch, it's okay if you don't expose the workers to too much of it. So a full day's work consisted of an hour and a half in the morning and an hour and a half in the afternoon. 3 hours a day. That's the maximum anybody was allowed to work. And that kept the problem under control. Okay, so how did they do it? They use something called the shield method, which I'll try and simplify for you. Think of it as a tin can, open at both ends, that you're shoving through the mud, sort of right below the bottom of the river. Well, you shove this pipe or this tin can into the mud with the compressed air holding the river and the mud back. And I mean, it's amazingly simple. And then you place the men with pick and shovel at the front end, and they scrape away at the mud and the rock. And then there's other workers who remove it by means of a little railroad. But it's very tricky, because if the air pressure is too low, the river comes in and the men drown. If the pressure is too high, you blow the men out into the river. Very, very tricky. But they had it figured out. They did their calculations. Now, another interesting question, most of the time we don't think about, you're removing all this rock and mud, where do you put it? Fortunately, in those days there was no EPA. They had a solution. They dumped it in the swamps of Jersey City, which Frank Hague was quite okay with, because that increases the acreage and increases the ratables. And nobody talked about the endangered wetlands in those days. Okay, so the big breakthrough, well, let's see. Once the tunnel's finished, you have this long tube with one end in Jersey City and the other end in Manhattan. How are you going to ventilate it? Well, there's two ways to ventilate it. There's the longitudinal method and there's the transverse method. The longitudinal method would be, okay, let's put a big fan in Jersey City and we'll blow the air towards Manhattan, or vice versa. It's a dumb idea, because first of all, that would have to be a fan with the velocity of a hurricane, and what if there's a fire? It would feed the flames. So what they had to do was use a transverse method with multiple entrances for the fresh air and multiple exits for the exhausted air. And as you probably know, you have these two big ventilation towers at either end. Well, the amazing thing is that air gets changed completely every 90 seconds. So the air is changed 40 times every hour. Thank goodness. Otherwise, we would die. During the construction of the Holland Tunnel, 13 workers died. It was dangerous work. And then the saddest thing, Clifford Holland, he was working night and day and night. He was type A, obsessive, compulsive supervisor, and he literally worked himself to death. And he died on October 27th, 1924, at the tragically young age of 41. 41 years old, very young. And here's the worst part. When the Sandhogs were digging this tunnel, there was a team coming from New York towards New Jersey and a team coming from New Jersey towards New York, and they were to meet in the middle. They met on October 29th, 2 days after Clifford Holland died. Tragically, he did not live to see the completion of the tunnel. Well, one other thing I should explain, it'll be important for reasons that come later on. You know, when you and I drive through the Lincoln Tunnel or the Holland Tunnel, think of a cross-section, what we see is kind of a square or a rectangle. We see a ceiling, we see a roadway, and we see walls on either side. But what we see is kind of trompe-l'oeil, it's kind of fooling the eye, because that's not the tunnel, that's the shell within the tunnel. In other words, the Holland and Lincoln Tunnel is a square within a larger tube. Okay? So that's important to keep in mind for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is that's the way the ventilation system works. You blow in the fresh air below and you exit it from on top. So what we see is a little bit of an illusion. Okay, next point. They finished the tunnel in 1927. They're terribly afraid nobody will use the darn thing because of fear of drowning. But they also have to set the rates. And it's a tricky process because they don't want to set the rates too high or people will use the ferry instead. But they don't want to set the rates too low because they don't want to put the ferry out of business. For one thing, what if they need to close the tunnel for repair? They want to keep the ferries going. So they set the price on par with the ferries, and the price determined in 1927 was automobiles cost 50 cents, motorcycles cost 25 cents, buses were $1, and trucks could be as much as $2 depending on the number of axles. Now you're saying, my God, 50 cents, what a deal. But remember, this is 1927. And economic historians tell us that if you want to convert 1927 prices into today's prices, you multiply by 32. So, using advanced calculus, okay, okay, 32 times 50 cents, it was equivalent of $16 today. So we bitch about $12, okay? And think about this, our $12 is both ways. They had to pay, in effect, $16 each way. So, you know, just to put this into context, in 1927, you could buy a loaf of bread for 10 cents. So, you know, think about it, 50 cents, it wasn't cheap. Anyway, they also set the speed limit of 35 miles per hour, which is reasonable. And the law was you had to allow 75 feet of space between yourself and the vehicle in front of you. Good luck with that. Okay. You know yourself, everybody's right on your bumper. You know, think about it. 75 feet, the average car is 15 feet in length. That means you would have to leave 5 car lengths. Nobody leaves 5 car lengths. Everybody wants to get to the other side. They ride your bumper. And here's another interesting little piece of trivia. Remember, this is the 1920s. One of their big decisions.
How much is gas then?
That's a good question. I don't know. I assume it was a lot cheaper. Anyway, in the 1920s, one of their big decisions is, should we allow horse-drawn traffic? I mean, 1920s, we have to think about this. It's a long time ago. So it's the Roaring Twenties, you know, the Flappers, the Charleston, the Model A Ford came out in 1927. And the Model A Ford was a big success because they just invented installment buying. Okay, so the opening ceremonies are Saturday, November 12th, 1927. President Coolidge is in the White House. He presses a telegraph key, and the American flags part the entrances of the tunnel, and people go through. Governor Al Smith of New York, Governor Harry Moore of New Jersey, they meet at the very center, which is portrayed on the cover of my book. You know, that, hold up the cover so they can see that that tile mural. Okay, it's a beautiful thing, and that's where. So hold it around the corner so she can see. Okay, thank you, thank you. Okay, so anyway, what I argue in the book is that it's the most amazing thing. Remember I told you the authorities were worried nobody would use it? People loved it. They embraced it. It was financially successful beyond their wildest dreams. So the powers that be said, oh, my God, if people are willing to do this, and we're only servicing Lower Manhattan, hell, we should build a Midtown tunnel. And that's the genesis of the idea for the Lincoln Tunnel. So in my book, I kind of argue that the Lincoln Tunnel is the son of Holland. If the Holland had not been successful, the Lincoln would have never been built. But the Lincoln, and they also learned from their mistakes. The Lincoln, instead of being 12 feet 6 inches tall, was 13 feet tall. The lanes, instead of being 8 feet wide, were 8 feet 6 inches wide. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it makes a big difference if you're driving a truck. So anyway, this is a great idea to build a Midtown tunnel, but there were a lot of frustrating delays. The idea really surfaced in 1928, 1 year after the completion of the Holland Tunnel. Let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. But what was the next year? 1929, the big crash. Nobody had any money. So the project was delayed. The first tube of the Lincoln Tunnel was not completed until 1937. And they said, oh, this is great, let's build a second one. And so they started work in 1938, but it was delayed by World War II. There were no men and no materials. So the second tube is not completed until 1945. A decision was made to make the third tube in 1951, but it was not finished until 1957, and you stop to think about it, 1957, that's 30 years after the completion of the Holland Tunnel. Took a long time. Anyway, in my book, I don't want to just talk about the engineering and the finance and the construction. I want to talk about how we use it. And writing from the point of view of a New Jerseyan, New Jerseyans see it as a mode of commuting. And so I talk a lot about commuting. Now, it's true New Yorkers do reverse commuting sometimes, like to come to beautiful New Jersey on the weekend, but and to use IKEA and other other places that don't have such high taxes. Anyway, a recurring theme in our American experience is our love of mobility. We love the open road, and it's an idea that can be traced all through American literature. I remember Walt Whitman's iconic poem, Song of the Open Road, 1856. And you remember Jack Kerouac's novel, On the Road, 1957. And even today, here's a recent ad that I saw about an automobile. Wind in your hair and a guaranteed uplift in your sexual performance. But it's hard to feel like an alpha male when you're stuck behind the wheel in traffic, bumper to bumper, cursing the other drivers, being late for your appointment. For most commuters going through the Lincoln and Holland Tunnel to work, it's not liberating, it's not sexy, and it's not fun. But there is one bright spot. If you listen to CBS radio, from high above the fray in their helicopter, you hear the words, mass transit is on or close to schedule. So the commuters who use mass transit feel morally superior to those in the private cars. Here's a letter to the editor written by Christine Bredell of Rutherford, New Jersey. She wrote a letter to the editor of the Bergen Record. Here's what Christine said. A few weeks ago, I happened to glance out the window of the 190 New Jersey transit bus that I take to and from work every day. I looked at the thousands of cars waiting to go through the Lincoln Tunnel. And it dawned on me, more than 90% of them contained only a single driver. One person in each of those thousands of cars. I wondered at the selfishness of these commuters who are more attached to their cars than they are to the environment. Okay. In addition, transit users can use their time more productively because they don't have to drive. They can read the newspaper, they can do crossword puzzles, they can watch the movie on a laptop, they can check their mail on a smartphone. A useful way that I found to think about the Trans-Hudson tunnels is to consider a very ordinary object, the ordinary kitchen funnel, which can be described as a pipe with a wide open conical mouth and a narrow stem. So in this metaphor, the narrow stem is the tunnel itself, and the conical opening represents the approach roads. I talked to one weary Port Authority cop who's stationed every morning at the mouth of the Lincoln Tunnel on the Jersey side. He said in a weary voice, every morning it's the same thing. We're trying to stuff 100 pounds of potatoes into a 75-pound sack. Frequent users know that the actual delays, more often than not, occur on the approach roads. You've had this experience. Once you get in the tunnel itself, it's okay. It's trying to get into the tunnel that's so difficult. Anyway, as I said, I didn't want to just talk about engineering and finance and commuting. I wanted to see how these artifacts have inspired us in the arts. And there's a number of very interesting things out there, many of which are currently on display, if you get the chance, at the Hoboken Historical Museum just across the river. For example, let's talk about literature. It's all kinds of stuff out there, novels, films, television, children's writing, poetry, humor. First, let me mention an important novel. There's several, but I'm just going to mention one of them here. Stephen King's novel, The Stand. Maybe you've heard of that book. It was published in 1978. It's very lengthy. It has 832 pages. And the plot is that the U.S. Army has developed some kind of super flu as part of germ warfare. And something went awry, and 99.4% of humanity is killed. There's only one survivor in Manhattan. His name is Larry Underwood. And he decides he has to flee Manhattan and get over to New Jersey. But there's problems because he can't use a car because there's all these dead drivers slumped over their steering wheels. So he decides he's going to have to walk to New Jersey, and he decides he's going to go through the Lincoln Tunnel. Well, there's National Guardsmen guarding the Lincoln Tunnel to prevent people from escaping, but they're all dead too, so it's not a... Okay, so what he has to do, it's so crowded, he has to climb over the roofs and hoods of these cars to get over to New Jersey. And when he finally gets to New Jersey, he gets to Weehawken and he says, ah, there's fresh air. New Jersey never smelled so good. And he proceeds to find other survivors, and they restart humanity. Then there's that wonderful film, perhaps you saw, Daylight, came out in 1996. It stars Sylvester Stallone as the chief of EMS. Here's the plot. There's a group of thieves that they hold up the diamond district, and they have a trunk full of diamonds. But the cops are chasing them. So they want to escape to New Jersey through the Lincoln Tunnel. But they're driving at a very high rate of speed, and unfortunately, they crash into a convoy of trucks carrying illegal, toxic, volatile chemicals. Boom! The tunnel blows up, and it's closed off at both ends. And the people are trapped. Who can save them? Only Sylvester Stallone. It's really tricky because the only way he can save them is to go down through the ventilation tunnels, the ventilation towers. But the ventilation towers have these fans that kick in every 40 seconds. So he has to somehow rappel down the ventilation towers without being chopped up by the ventilation fans. But of course he succeeds, and he goes down, and he's helping the people. He finds a beautiful young woman down there who also needs help, of course. And you know, most intellectuals don't take this film very seriously. It's an action thriller. But surprisingly, the critics were kind of kind to it. Here's what Susan Stark of Detroit News said. You've got fire, flood, and mud. You've got poisoned air, frazzled electrical connections, crumbling masonry. You've got rats. What's not to like? Gary Arnold of the Washington Times summarized the film. He said, vivid apprehensions about death by collision, crushing, suffocation, and conflagration are confirmed in a matter of minutes and enhanced by fears of drowning. Finally, the Buffalo News paid it the ultimate compliment, compared it to a couple of classic horror films. Here's what Melinda Miller said. Daylight will do for tunnels what Jaws did for the beach and what Psycho did for showers. And then, of course, who could forget the HBO series The Sopranos, which ran from 1999 through 2007. It went through 6 seasons, it went through 86 episodes, and Tony Soprano was played by Rutgers' own James Gandolfino. And you recall the opening montage of every single show. Tony emerges from the north tube of the Lincoln Tunnel and goes up the helix. And we actually see the tiled ceiling of the Lincoln Tunnel. So he may be a family man, but he's also grim and vulgar and corrupt and racist and sexist and murderous. But it's not just films and novels. There's also children's literature. And perhaps those of you of a certain age may remember a famous children's book from the 1950s. Now, we're all familiar with the classics. Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne, and more recently, the imaginative rhymes of Dr. Seuss. But easily overlooked is this minor gem. It's called The Chicken in the Tunnel. Let me share with you this great gem. It's a book clearly written for children. It's lavishly illustrated. It's intended to be read from front to back in a single sitting. The central character is a chicken named Squawky. And he's a very young chicken. And he's owned by a farmer named Mr. Hay. And they're in upstate New York. And Mr. Hay is about to take a load of chickens to market in New York. And Squawky naively thinks this will make a wonderful trip. And he asks to be taken along. Farmer Hay says, no, you're too little, but Squawky insists. So Farmer Hay puts Squawky in one of the cages. He's loaded aboard the truck. The truck gets halfway through the Lincoln Tunnel. Squawky becomes alarmed at the noise and traffic and squeezes out of the cage. Now, the chicken is loose in the tunnel. Fortunately, the chicken is spotted by a little girl in the back seat of her father's car. The little girl says, there's a chicken in the tunnel. But the father is very dismissive of her report. At length, the father becomes convinced that it's true, and he reports there's a chicken in the tunnel to the police officer. The police officer, of course, is very skeptical. All these dim-witted grown-ups just don't get it, and they're slow to catch on to the truth. Finally, the authorities stop the traffic, they rescue the chicken, and Squawky's taken back to upstate New York to live out his days, presumably to live happily ever after. So we have a novel, we have movies, we have children's literature, but let's not stop there. We have poetry as well. Here's a poem by New Jersey's poet laureate Joel Lewis. It's called A Crutch for a Crab, but it requires a little bit of explanation. If I were a crab, I wouldn't need a crutch to cross over the Hudson River. But since we're not crabs, we do need a crutch. And the crutch, of course, is the tunnel. Okay, you with me? So it goes like this. Traffic sheds reminisce, so save a thought for Clifford Holland, the genius of the first vehicular tunnel, that allowed Subsilt Passage, note the alliteration there, beneath the Hudson. Holland worked and worked and worked, repetition, until the greater bosses said, "You look tired, go home and take a rest," which he did forever. So you see, the pro forma utterance, go home, take a rest, and the boss might say that anytime, but no, the punchline is, he died. Okay, which finally solved the problem of what to name the tubes that grew Tribeca, triangle below canal, and the Horseshoe District of Jersey City, in a continual birth of traffic. Plus a rarely noticed bust of an above-average guy. If you're ever leaving New York for New Jersey through the Holland Tunnel and you look to your left, which I don't recommend, you should watch the traffic, there is a bust of Clifford Holland set into the concrete and the facing of the tunnel. A bust of an above-average guy who could have honestly said, "This job is killing me," like many say daily. His family remembers that Holland loved to talk while eating. He's a type A guy. And he hated ketchup bottles because they ruined the symmetry of the dining room table. Very neat and tidy guy. Mr. Holland made the riverbed humble public ground where the commuter's air is scrubbed and rendered potable every 42 seconds. Now, I wouldn't be doing my duty if I didn't also mention how the tunnels figure in humor. You remember Saturday Night Live? This television sketch on NBC began in 1975, often dealing with American popular culture. And sure enough, by the third season, they finally got around to the Holland Tunnel. Okay, the scene opens. There's an apartment building in Queens, and there's two attractive young women, Lynn and Barb. They're playing ping pong in the rec room of the apartment building. They're joined by George and Jortuk, who are two wild and crazy guys, two brothers from Czechoslovakia. They're unfashionably dressed in loud, unbuttoned polyester shirts with gold chains. The two brothers desperately and awkwardly try to pick up the girls, who are totally unimpressed. In an unsuccessful effort to bond with the girls, the two brothers demonstrate their awkward and ridiculous disco dance moves. The brothers are very insistent about meeting up later with the two girls, who are eager to shake them off. So the ensuing dialogue goes like this. Lynn says, "I've got an idea. Do you know the Holland Tunnel?" "Of course, we swing there often." "Well, meet us in the middle of the Lincoln Tunnel, or meet us in the middle of the Holland Tunnel. Do you know the man in the glass booth?" "Naturally." "Well, you go there and park and wait for us." "Okay, we'll have a swinging time." Okay. Actually, there's not much danger of flooding in the tunnels. The real danger is of fire. Now, most of the time, the bridge and tunnel agents can put out these small car fires right on the spot. But once in a while, there's a super terrific fire, the most famous of which took place on May 13th, 1949, at the Lincoln Tunnel. May 13th, 1949, 8:30 in the morning. There was a tractor trailer headed from New Jersey to New York through the Lincoln Tunnel with no placards. You know, the placards are those diamond-shaped things that every truck is supposed to have that shows the contents. And that tells the firefighters what to deal with. Well, the reason this truck didn't carry placards is it had an illegal cargo. They had 80 55-gallon drums of carbon disulfide. Now, in case you've forgotten high school chemistry, carbon disulfide is amber-colored, very volatile, and poisonous, with a low ignition temperature. It's pretty bad stuff. It's used in the manufacture of cellophane and rayon. Okay, it sounds like a horror movie. A 55-gallon drum of carbon disulfide falls off the truck. Okay, steel drum, asphalt surface, a spark, low ignition temperature. This is a very volatile substance. The bridge and tunnel agents can't handle it. The Jersey City Fire Department arrives at 9:05. The Fire Department of New York arrives at 9:12. And their first priority is rescue before they can deal with fire suppression. Now, picture this. The truck has, for all practical purposes, blown up. It's knocked out the floor and ceiling and walls of the tunnel. The cars are all backed up. What the firemen need to do is to rescue the people in their cars. But people are funny. You know, you pay a lot of money for your car, you don't want to leave it behind. So the firemen are begging the people to leave. You know, they're in danger of their life, and they're attached to their car. And they're also worried about their appointment. You know, maybe they have a love affair on the other side of the Hudson, or maybe they have an important business meeting, and they're so focused on getting the other side, the firemen trying to leave already. And then, but then other people, and this is so crazy, you remember that the tunnel goes sort of like this, you know, it goes down and then back up. Well, the common sense thing to do is to go up the way you came in. But heat and smoke rise. It just gets worse and worse if you use the common sense. What you have to do is obey the firefighter's orders, which is it's complicated, but bear with me. There's something called an adit, which is a little doorway that links the westbound and eastbound tunnels. So the thing to do, obey the fireman, leave your damn car behind, and go through the adit and exit through the other tunnel. But the firemen had an awful time trying to explain this to people. The people were just determined to stay in their expensive cars. Anyway, finally they get the people out of the cars, then they can put out the fire. Dozens of cars and 10 trucks were destroyed. 600 feet of tunnel was floor, wall, ceiling destroyed. The cost of the repairs was $1,1949, which today would be about $7.5 million. There were 66 injuries, 27 of which required hospitalization. Amazingly, there were no deaths. The fine for the driver, $50 fine and 5 days in jail. Afterwards, they increased the fine, and they increased now it's a $5,000 fine and 7 years in jail. A little more fitting for the offense. Okay, one of the things we worry about all the time in these days is terrorism. You may remember back in 2006, the New York Daily News and the Post had these screaming headlines. There was a plot to bomb the Holland Tunnel. And the NYPD undercover officers had uncovered the plot. There were 8 plotters of various nationalities, including Lebanese, Saudi, Yemeni, Jordanian, Palestinian, and Iranian. Their idea was that they were going to blow up the Holland Tunnel, which would flood with water. Then the water would rush into Manhattan and drown Manhattan just like New Orleans. Fortunately, these terrorists weren't very bright. Manhattan is above sea level. That plan would not exactly work. And anyway, it was thwarted. But just to put your mind at ease, let's imagine the worst, that there's a truck bomb that goes through either tunnel, take your pick, and let's imagine it goes to the middle of the tunnel, it's deliberately exploded. What would happen? Well, I've talked to a lot of engineers, and here's the consensus. It would cause damage. There would be tremendous air pressure and tremendous heat. It would destroy the nearby cars and trucks, as well as much of the tunnel shell, you know, the ceiling, the floor, the sides. But here's the interesting thing. Utter destruction of the tunnel is extremely unlikely. And the reason for that is simple high school physics. Remember, the tunnel is open at both ends. So the force of the blast is going to go out towards either exit rather than against the wall of the tunnel. So because the blast is directed towards both ends, flooding of the tunnel is very, very unlikely. I can't say impossible, but very unlikely. So that's a little bit reassuring, I hope. Unless you're right next to the truck, of course. Let me talk a little bit about the future of tunnels. There's a number of problems, structural problems that we have in the New York, New Jersey region. One problem is infrastructure maintenance. It just hasn't been done as it should be. You know yourself, the potholes, the Pulaski Skyway, infrastructure maintenance is not kept up. The other problem is simply a matter of road capacity and congestion. Now, an obvious solution, as city planners tell us, is congestion pricing, which you remember Mayor Michael Bloomberg did float that idea in 2006. But the State Assembly in Albany did not pass it in 2008. So what else is new? Albany doesn't let New York City function. But a bold plan almost came to fruition. This was a bold plan launched by Frank Lautenberg, New Jersey Senator Frank Lautenberg. And this plan went under several different names. Perhaps you've heard of them. Access to the Region's Core, which is an acronym ARC, the Trans-Hudson Express, or the Mass Transit Tunnel. It was a brilliant plan, and it was groundbreaking in June of 2009. It would have taken 8 years to finish, and it was at a projected cost of $8.7 billion. The idea was to have twin rail tubes, and they would come in 180 feet below Penn Station at 34th Street. And it would have moved lots and lots of people. It was a great plan. It should have been finished in 2018. But unfortunately, Governor Chris Christie pulled the plug October 7th, 2010. Here's what the leading newspaper in New Jersey, the Star-Ledger, had to say about that in their editorial the very next day. The governor's decision to kill the Hudson River Tunnel will go down as a blunder of historic proportions. It will stunt the state's job market, depress home values, and leave us with nightmarish traffic jams and dirtier air. So I wish I could say something on a more hopeful note about the future, but unfortunately, Chris Christie pulled the plug on that project. So thank you for your attention. Books are for sale. We have a few minutes, so I can take a few questions.
Whatever happened while you...
And we have wine coming. Okay, great.
What happened to the guards that used to walk the tunnel?
Good question, good question.
And maybe some people don't remember.
Yeah.
You and I remember.
I remember, yeah. You and I are relatively young. Yeah. Okay, here's the deal. When the Holland Tunnel was first started, and the Port Authority took over, they used the Port Authority police to patrol the tunnel, and they were men on the catwalk. But as I describe in the book, here's a curious thing happened. The Port Authority police who were patrolling the tunnels were profoundly unhappy. You think about it, you know, to hire a policeman who goes through the police academy, you know, they're trained in firearms and first aid and fire suppression. You know, it's not that easy to become a cop. And here these guys were watching the cars go by. They were bored. They were bored out of their minds. They hated the job. And they were highly paid. And they weren't doing that much. Yeah, they were highly paid. Their biggest job was to keep the traffic moving, to maximize the tolls. So the powers that be in the Port Authority came up with a scheme to replace the Port Authority police with a new classification of worker called bridge and tunnel agents, who didn't require as much training, were not as highly paid, and ironically, people who took pride in their new job. So it worked out rather well. And these guys would patrol back and forth. Then time went by. The Port Authority said, well, you know, these guys are on foot. They can only patrol so much. We'll invent these little motorized catwalk cars that they can scoot along like a motor scooter and cover more territory. We can hire fewer of them. And so that lasted for a while. Lasted till last year. But anyway, nowadays, you never see anybody. You don't see them in the glass booth. You don't see them in the catwalk. Reason? video cameras. There's no need to have people in the tunnel. They have like a big war room with lots of television screens, and if something goes wrong, they can pinpoint the problem, and it's really not needed to have people in it. So very good question.
What year was it? When did they stop that? Many years ago, I think.
Well, it was a gradual process. You know, the cops were replaced by the bridge and tunnel agents, and then they got the catwalk cars, and blah, blah, blah. I don't know the exact date.
That's
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Question, comment, rebuttal? Yeah.
Just a little off topic, but you were talking about the ARC project in the train tunnel.
Yeah.
Do you know how many train tracks go under the Hudson into Penn Station today?
You put me on the spot, but I'll take a guess. You have the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, which was taken over by the Port Authority, renamed PATH, which stands for Port Authority Trans-Hudson.
I mean the Penn Station.
Penn Station.
2 tracks?
It's 2, I think, yeah.
There's
2.
4 that go to Brooklyn, to get the Long Island ones,
Yeah.
Side Yards, and only 2 tracks.
Yeah.
Passengers. That's
Yeah, and the worst thing about Penn Station, if I may, I think everybody knows this, is the platforms, the stairs, the elevators, the escalators. You're just too small for the volume of people there. You know, you're just so crowded in. And that was the great thing about the ARC tunnel. They had wider platforms, wider stairs, more escalators. It breaks my heart that it wasn't approved. Anyone else? Questions, comments? I guess we're done. Okay, I'll stay. Oh, wait a minute, there's a question.
Which tunnel is longer, the Holland or the Lincoln?
Oh, I think the Lincoln is a little bit longer. The Holland, I think, is 8,000 feet. I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, but we could always Google it. I think the Lincoln is a tad longer, because the Lincoln has sort of a bend to it, you know. Okay, thanks for coming out.